Frost bit through her base layers, tasting like pennies and stale adrenaline. They called her Doll because she stood 4'9". They laughed when her boots dangled off the bench. Tonight, at 3,010 meters, those same men would choke on their own blood while she saved them. Aviation fuel and frozen sweat made the Chinook's cargo bay smell like a high-altitude abattoir. Nora sat wedged between O'Connor and Gaines, the vibration of the twin rotors rattling the fillings in her molars. She chewed the inside of her cheek. Copper flooded her tongue. It grounded her. Her boots didn't touch the deck. It was a simple matter of geometry. The canvas troop seats were bolted at a standard height for standard men. Nora was not a standard man. At 4 feet and 9 inches, her heels hung a clear 2 inches above the non-slip grating. Gaines noticed. He always noticed. He nudged Wyatt, pointing a thick Nomex-gloved finger at her dangling feet. "Careful, Doll." Gaines crackled over the internal comms, his voice distorted by the heavy static of the headset. "Hit a bad air pocket and you might bounce right out of your car seat." Wyatt chuckled. O'Connor, her spotter, just stared straight ahead, though the corners of his eyes crinkled behind his ballistic goggles. Nora didn't blink. She didn't offer a middle finger or a witty comeback. She just tightened her grip on the Pelican case resting across her thighs. Inside was a custom-milled Chaytak M200 intervention chambered in .408. The rifle weighed 31 pounds unloaded. Nora weighed 106 pounds soaking wet. Carrying her weapon, her body armor, her winter survival gear, and her ammunition meant she was humping over 60% of her own body weight. Her hips carried a perpetual, bruised ache that never fully healed. She hated the nickname. Doll. It started in Bud/S, whispered by instructors who placed bets on which day her femurs would snap under the log PT. It stuck because she looked like a porcelain figurine next to the 6'4" behemoths of Team 3. She had pale skin that burned easily and a quiet, unassuming face. But porcelain breaks. Nora didn't. She just compressed, turning denser, harder, and meaner. The red light in the cabin flicked to green. 1 minute. The crew chief bellowed, holding up a single finger. The ramp lowered, letting in a violent howl of sub-zero wind. It was Christmas Eve. Down in the valley, the world was supposedly singing carols and drinking spiced rum. Up here, in the jagged teeth of the Hindu Kush, the air was thin enough to induce hypoxia and cold enough to freeze the moisture in your tear ducts. They unbuckled. Nora dropped to the deck, her knees absorbing the shock. The men stood towering over her like redwoods. She pushed past Gaines, ignoring the way his elbow clipped her helmet. It wasn't malicious, just clumsy. To them, she was a mascot who somehow passed the pipeline. To her, they were large, loud targets. Schaefer, the team lead, slapped her shoulder as they moved to the edge of the ramp. "You and O'Connor take the high ridge. Give us eyes on the compound. We breach at 0200. "Copy," Nora said. Her voice was raspy, stripped of any inflection. They stepped out into the void. The snow was thigh-deep on Gaines. It was waist-deep on Nora. Every step required her to lift her knee to her chest, drag her heavy boot forward, and plunge it into the crust. Her lungs burned. The air tasted like dry ice, scouring her throat with every inhale. O'Connor took point, breaking the trail, but the rut he left was too wide for her natural gait. She had to awkwardly stretch her legs to step in his prints, her hip flexors screaming in protest. Nobody offered to carry her gear. If they had, she would have shot them. For 3 hours they climbed in absolute silence. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic crunch of Gore-Tex boots breaking through the icy crust and the ragged, shallow breathing of people operating at 12,000 feet. Nora's nose ran. The mucus froze into a brittle crust on her upper lip before she could wipe it away. She ignored it. She ignored the agonizing friction blister forming on her left heel. She focused entirely on the math: distance, elevation, barometric pressure, temperature, humidity, spin drift, Coriolis effect. Sniper work wasn't an art. Art was subjective. Sniper work was ruthless physics. The bullet didn't care about your feelings, your gender, or your height. The bullet only cared about gravity and drag. If you fed the right data into the scope, the universe had to comply. It was the only place in the world where Nora felt she had absolute control. They reached the overwatch position at 0130. It was a miserable shelf of jagged shale jutting out from the mountainside, offering a commanding, terrifying view of the valley below. The target compound sat on a plateau across the gorge, a fortress of mud brick and cinder block surrounded by concertina wire. O'Connor dropped to his knees, immediately pulling out his entrenching tool to dig out a shallow hide in the snow. Nora lay flat on the ice. She unlatched the pelican case. The metal hinges were so cold they bit through her gloves, stinging her fingertips. She lifted the Chaytak out of the foam. It was a massive, ugly piece of machinery. The tubular receiver and oversized muzzle brake made it look like industrial plumbing. She slammed the bolt back. It slid with a heavy metallic shuck-clack that sounded obscenely loud in the thin air. "Talk to me, O'Connor," she muttered, settling her cheek against the cold kydex of the stock. O'Connor brought up the spotting scope and checked his Kestrel weather meter. He squinted into the eyepiece. "Target compound is quiet," he whispered. "Distance. Jesus." He pulled back from the glass, wiping frost from his eyelashes. He checked his laser rangefinder again. "Doll, you're not going to like this." "Give me the number, O'Connor." 3,010 meters. Nora's gloved finger paused over the elevation turret. 3,010 meters. Nearly 2 miles. The official maximum effective range of the .408 Chaytak was roughly 2,500 meters. Anything past that was considered a prayer to a god who wasn't listening. Wind is at our backs 6 knots, but it's swirling in the gorge. Crosswinds at the halfway mark are reading anywhere from 10 to 15 knots. O'Connor said, his voice tight. "We're too far back, Nora. Schaefer misjudged the topography. If they get into trouble down there, we can't cover them." Nora didn't move. She stared through the optic. The compound looked like a blurry postage stamp in a sea of static grey. "I have the distance," she said quietly. "Nora, the drop at that range is over 1,000 inches. You're lobbing artillery at this point. The bullet will be in the air for over 6 seconds. "I have the distance," she repeated. She dialed the turret. Click, click, click. The sound was sharp, finite. Down in the valley, the assault team, Schaefer, Gaines, Wyatt, and 4 others were tiny thermal blips moving like ghosts against the black snow. They were stacking up on the outer wall. It was 1 minute to 0200. Merry Christmas. Ice seeped through Nora's sleeping mat, radiating up through her ribs. Her core temperature was dropping. She could tell by the slight sluggishness in her cognitive processing, the way her thoughts felt like they were moving through thick syrup. She forced herself to flex her toes inside her boots, feeling the dull, dead throb of restricted circulation. "Schaefer is at the breach point." O'Connor murmured, his breath pluming in short, rhythmic bursts. Nora kept her eye glued to the scope. The crosshairs rested over the main courtyard of the compound. At 3 kilometers, the magnification of the glass fought against atmospheric mirage and the fading ambient light. Even with the thermal clip-on, the edges of the buildings bled into the surrounding rocks. "Something's wrong," Nora said. Her voice was flat, but the hair on the back of her neck stood up. It wasn't a sixth sense. It was pattern recognition. The compound was entirely unlit. No generator hum, no braziers burning in the guard towers, no stray dogs barking at the scent of the approaching assaulters. Insurgent strongholds were never this disciplined. There was always a careless sentry smoking a cheap cigarette, always a stray light from a doorway. This place was completely dead. A black hole. "Schaefer, this is Overwatch." O'Connor whispered into the mic. "Target building is cold. Too cold. Confirm your posture." Static hissed back. "Breach in 10. Keep your eyes up, O'Connor." Schaefer's voice was tight with pre-combat adrenaline. He wasn't listening. Nora shifted her rifle a fraction of an inch to the right, scanning the secondary ridge that overlooked the compound. If she were defending this valley, she wouldn't put her men behind the mud brick walls. She'd put them up high. She dialed back the magnification to widen her field of view. The thermal sensor swept across the dark, jagged rocks of the eastern ridge. Suddenly the screen bloomed. Not one, not two. 9 distinct heat signatures flared to life along the crest of the ridge, perfectly elevated to look down into the courtyard Schaefer was about to enter. The signatures were grouped in pairs. One of them was large, unnaturally hot. A heavy weapon. "Ambush." Nora said the word punching out of her lungs. "O'Connor, Eastern Ridge 9 hostiles. They've got a DSHK. O'Connor swung his spotting scope wildly. "Holy shit! Schaefer, abort, abort! You are walking into a fatal funnel. 9 tangos on the Eastern Ridge." "Breaching," Gaines's voice barked over the net. A silent, bright flash bloomed at the compound's gate as the breaching charge detonated. Seconds later, the dull thud rolled up the mountain, echoing off the canyon walls. Schaefer's team poured into the courtyard. Instantly, the Eastern Ridge erupted. Even from 3 kilometers away, Nora could see the massive, strobing muzzle flashes of the DSHK 12.7mm heavy machine gun. Tracers the size of beer bottles rained down into the courtyard, chewing through the cinderblock walls like they were made of wet cardboard. "Contact, contact, right!" Wyatt screamed over the comms, his voice cracking. "Gaines is hit, we're pinned. We need suppression. Overwatch, take them out." O'Connor panicked. He looked from the kestrel to the valley, his hands shaking. "Schaefer, we can't. We're at 3,000 meters. We can't reach that ridge." "Do it anyway." Schaefer roared, the sound of tearing concrete and heavy gunfire drowning out his comms. "Nora, we have to move down," O'Connor said, grabbing her shoulder. "We have to close the distance. It'll take us 40 minutes to get into a firing position." Nora violently shrugged off his hand. "They don't have 40 minutes. Gaines will bleed out in 5. She sucked in a sharp breath. The cold air burned all the way down to her diaphragm. She pushed the pain away. She pushed the noise of the radio away. She shrank her entire universe down to the millimeter grid of her reticle. "Give me the wind call for the DSHK," Nora ordered. "Nora, it's impossible. The bullet will drop nearly 90 feet. The Coriolis effect alone will push it 2 feet to the right. The wind is chaotic. Give me the fucking wind, O'Connor." He swallowed hard, pressing his eye to the spotting scope. "Target is stationary. Machine gun nest. Range is 3,110 meters. Wind is blowing left to right, full value at 8 knots, but it's swirling in the gorge. Call it 12 MOA left." Nora's thumb slicked over the windage knob. She dialed 12 minutes of angle. She adjusted the elevation, cranking the turret almost to its absolute maximum limit. She opened her bolt, grabbed a massive .408 cartridge from her wristband, and manually seated it into the chamber. She closed the bolt. It locked with heavy finality. Through the scope, the machine gunner was a bright white thermal blob, frantically feeding a belt into the weapon. Nora exhaled. She let the air drain entirely from her lungs, bringing her heart rate down. The heavy thumping in her chest slowed. Thump, thump, thump. She needed to account for the rotation of the earth. She needed to account for the fact that the bullet would fly through 3 different temperature zones on its way across the gorge. She drifted the crosshairs high and to the left of the gunner, aiming at nothing but empty black sky. Her finger stiff with cold found the trigger shoe. It was a 2-stage trigger set to a hair trigger brake of 1.5 pounds. She pulled through the first stage, met the wall. "Send it," O'Connor whispered. Nora broke the wall. The rifle violently bucked backwards, slamming into her bruised shoulder with the force of a sledgehammer. The massive muzzle brake redirected the expanding gases sideways, kicking up a blinding cloud of snow and ice dust. The crack of the shot deafened her right ear, ringing sharply inside her helmet. She didn't flinch. She instantly racked the bolt, ejecting the smoking brass casing, and slammed a second round home. "Splash in 6 seconds." O'Connor muttered, his voice trembling. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Nora stared through the settling snow dust. 6. On the eastern ridge, the bright white blob behind the machine gun suddenly violently exploded backward. The heavy DSK immediately ceased firing. The body slumped over the rocks, motionless. O'Connor stopped breathing. Over the comms, Schaefer yelled, "Good hit, good fucking hit, keep it coming, doll." Nora's lip curled into a tight, humorless line. She adjusted her grip on the stock. 8 hostiles left. The element of surprise was gone. The remaining targets on the ridge had stopped firing at the courtyard and were now frantically looking around, trying to figure out where the artillery was coming from. They didn't even realize they were being shot at by a rifle. "Wind is shifting," O'Connor said, his voice completely changed. The panic was gone. It was replaced by a clinical, terrifying awe. "Left to right, 10 knots. Target 2 is breaking cover, moving left." Nora adjusted her hold. She tracked the running thermal signature, calculating his speed, the flight time of the bullet, and the wind. "I have him," she whispered. She exhaled and pulled the trigger again. Recoil from a custom point, 408 Chetak, is not a push. It is a localized car crash. The cartridge was engineered specifically to kill past the 2-kilometer mark, which meant the kinetic energy transferring backward into Nora's shoulder was absolutely devastating. After her second shot, the deep purple bruise covering her clavicle bloomed into a sharp, tearing agony. It felt as though someone had jammed a red-hot railroad spike directly into the joint space. She racked the bolt. Hot brass spun out into the snow, hissing violently as it melted a tiny crater before instantly freezing over. The acrid scent of ammonia, burnt carbon, and sulfur clawed at the inside of her nose, cutting through the sterile smell of the mountain air. "Target 3. O'Connor breathed. His voice had fundamentally shifted. He was no longer a senior operator humoring a mascot. He was a spotter feeding raw data into a lethal precision machine. He's prone. Crawling towards the DSK, he's trying to reman the heavy gun. "Give me the distance," Nora rasped. Her throat felt lined with shattered glass. 3,115 meters. Wind is holding steady at 10 knots full value. Send it. Nora didn't hesitate. She didn't blink. Her stiffened finger squeezed the trigger shoe. The rifle bucked the heavy barrel, jumping upward despite the aggressive muzzle brake. The concussive blast rattled her molars, vibrating down her spine. Flight time. 6 excruciating seconds. She tracked the thermal blob through the optic. The man was moving agonizingly slow, dragging himself over the jagged rocks, his body a bright, hot white against the dead gray of the mountain. Splash. The blob stopped moving abruptly. A dark, jagged smear of heat sprayed across the frozen shale behind him, glowing briefly before the sub-zero air stole the warmth from his spilled blood. 3 down. Down in the valley courtyard, the radio crackled with heavy, panicked breathing. Wyatt was dragging Gaines behind a crumbling mud-brick water trough. "We're bounded. We can't push the main building. They're trying to flank us from the high ground." "I see them," Nora said, her voice dropping into a dead mechanical monotone. "O'Connor, give me the 2 on the left flank." "They're moving fast, Nora, running laterally down the slope. Elevation is shifting rapidly. Drop 3 MOA." She spun the elevation turret. Her gloves were incredibly thick, but the fingers underneath felt like useless wooden dowels. The blood had long since abandoned her extremities to keep her core alive. She had to rely entirely on the subtle, tactile click of the metal dial, trusting her hearing more than her nerve endings. She led the running target. Hitting a moving human at 3 kilometers was, mathematically speaking, a statistical impossibility. She had to calculate where the man would be in 6 seconds, accounting for the uneven terrain, his sprint speed, and the swirling crosswinds in the gorge. She squeezed the trigger. The boom echoed against the canyon walls. A miss. The heavy bullet impacted the rock face a full yard behind the runner, kicking up a massive, blinding shower of pulverized granite. The thermal camera caught the man stumbling from the sheer kinetic shockwave of the shrapnel, but he quickly recovered, diving headfirst behind a massive boulder. "Miss," O'Connor said flatly, betraying no emotion. "You shot behind him. Wind picked up mid-flight. 14 knots. Nora ground her teeth. The mistake cost her a cartridge. She only brought 20 rounds in her kit, unable to carry more without compromising her mobility. She couldn't afford to guess. "He's pinned behind the boulder," O'Connor analyzed. "Target 5 is breaking right. Standing up. He's panicking, looking for the drone." Nora swung the heavy barrel. The friction of the steel bipod feet dragging across the ice made a high, agonizing scraping sound. She found the standing target. He was looking up at the black sky, turning in circles, trying to find the Apache or the Reaper drone he assumed was raining fire down on them. He didn't understand the geometry of his own death. He couldn't fathom that a human being was doing this from the adjacent mountain. She held the reticle directly on his chest, adjusted for the new wind call, squeezed. The recoil punched her again. She tasted fresh blood. She had bitten her tongue during the recoil impulse. She swallowed it down, letting the sharp copper taste feed her focus. 6 seconds. The standing figure collapsed in on himself like a puppet with its strings abruptly severed, dropping instantly into the deep snow. 4 down. 5 left. "Good hit," O'Connor muttered. "Target 6 and 7 are retreating. They're abandoning the ridge." "No," Nora corrected, her eye glued to the ocular lens. "They aren't retreating. They're moving to the goat path to flank Schaefer's blind side." She pulled back from the optic for a fraction of a second. Her right eye throbbed violently, strained from the intense, unblinking focus. She blinked away the freezing tears that threatened to freeze her eyelashes together. The ambient temperature was plummeting further. The frozen steel of the receiver was leaching the heat straight out of her cheekbone. She felt a patch of her own skin stick to the Kydek's cheek rest. If she pulled away too fast, she would tear her own flesh. She pressed her face harder against it. "Distance to the goat path," she demanded. O'Connor checked his laser rangefinder, tapping the side of it as if it were malfunctioning. 3,200 meters. Nora, you are officially off the ballistic charts. I am doing the math in my head right now. Then do it faster, O'Connor. Give me 15 MOA left. Elevation. Max it out. Hold over another 2 mils in the reticle. She dialed the top turret until it physically stopped turning. It had hit the mechanical limit of the scope. The optic was pitched so far downward that she was looking through the extreme distorted upper edge of the glass. She had to use the tiny hash marks etched into the reticle to compensate for the remaining drop. 2 figures scrambled down a narrow, treacherous defile. If they made it to the bottom, they would be positioned directly above Wyatt and Gaines, firing straight down into their non-existent cover. She took a slow, agonizing breath. Held it. Fired. The casing ejected. She loaded another round instantly, fired again. 2 shots in rapid succession. A desperate, incredibly risky move. The recoil compounded, driving her bruised shoulder into the unforgiving rock beneath her thin sleeping mat. A sharp, audible pop echoed in her collarbone. Pain, bright and white-hot, flared down her right arm, turning her bicep to dead weight. "Splash 1!" O'Connor yelled. "Splash 2, both targets down, holy shit, doll!" Nora let out a ragged, painful gasp, her breath fogging the scope. "Don't call me that. 6 targets down. 3 remained. The radio spat a violent burst of static. Overwatch, this is Schaefer. The team leader's voice cracked, strained with exhaustion and fear. Gaines is fading. The tourniquet isn't holding. He's bleeding out through the junctional artery. We need an exfil bird now, but we can't move until that ridge is completely sanitized. 3 left, Schaefer. O'Connor replied, his thumb pressing hard on the push-to-talk button. We're working on it. Keep his head down. Nora's right arm was trembling uncontrollably. It wasn't the bitter cold anymore. It was total muscle failure. The sheer 31-pound weight of the rifle combined with the brutal repetitive kinetic impact of the massive .408 rounds was micro-tearing her rotator cuff. She tried to clench her right fist. Her fingers responded sluggishly, vibrating with severe nerve shock. She pressed her bruised, bleeding face back against the freezing stock, ignoring the sharp sting of peeling skin. Find them, O'Connor. Scanning, I don't see them. They've gone to ground. The distant ridge was eerily quiet on the thermal display. The remaining 3 insurgents had finally realized that moving meant dying. They had wedged themselves deeply into the crevices of the rocks, letting the massive thermal mass of the mountain absorb and hide their heat signatures. I need a target, Nora whispered. The mirage radiating from her blistering hot barrel was starting to severely distort the lower third of her scope. She reached up with her clumsy left hand, wrapping a piece of insulated camouflage tape around the barrel to suppress the heat waves. Down in the valley, a single AK-47 muzzle flash sparked from a dark gap in the rocks on the ridge. A burst of 7.62mm fire slammed into the mud wall, mere inches from Schaefer's head, showering him with dust. Got one, O'Connor snapped, dialing his magnification. He's tucked inside a vertical fissure. Range is 3,150 meters, but he's behind hard cover, Nora. You only have a 6-inch gap where his rifle barrel is poking through. A 6-inch gap. At nearly 2 miles. It was the ballistic equivalent of trying to shoot a dime from across a football stadium in a swirling blizzard with completely numb hands. Wind? She asked, her voice cracking. Fucked, O'Connor said honestly, dropping the professional jargon. It's gusting violently in the gorge. I'm seeing severe updrafts bouncing off the canyon floor. Hold dead center on the rock gap, add 2 mils of elevation for the updraft, and pray. Nora centered the crosshairs on the dark sliver between the rocks. She didn't pray. She didn't believe in a merciful God who would put her on a frozen, hostile rock in the Hindu Kush just to let her fail. She believed in velocity. She believed in terminal mass. Her trembling, stiff finger found the trigger. She forced her ragged breathing to slow. The chaotic mountain wind whipped loose snow across the back of her neck, melting down into her collar and sending fresh shivers down her spine. She waited for a lull. The agonizing milliseconds stretched into eternity. The wind died for exactly half a second. She fired. The recoil twisted her upper body violently. The pain in her shoulder spiked so intensely that her vision whited out for a blinding second. She gritted her teeth, tasting copper again, fighting the sudden overwhelming urge to vomit from the deep trauma in her joint. She forced her swollen eye back open. 6 seconds. Through the narrow fissure in the rocks, the thermal camera caught a sudden violent spray of heat. The mangled AK-47 clattered out of the gap and bounced uselessly down the rocky slope. Target 7 neutralized, O'Connor said, his voice dropping a full octave. He lowered the spotting scope and looked at her. Really looked at her. He didn't see a mascot anymore. He saw a monster. Nora didn't look back. She mechanically pulled the bolt handle. It was stiff. Carbon fouling and the plummeting temperatures were freezing the action shut. She had to hit the metal bolt handle with the heel of her palm to force it open, bruising her hand in the process. The empty casing ejected lazily, landing softly in the snow. 2 left. She gasped. Her breath was coming in ragged, painful hitches that tore at her lungs. Where? Before O'Connor could answer, a loud, terrifying whistling crack snapped directly over their heads. A chunk of shale exploded to Nora's left, showering her Kevlar helmet with sharp, heavy debris. "They found us!" O'Connor yelled, flattening his entire body against the ice. "The last two, they've got PKM machine guns. They're just walking the fire up the mountain." Another heavy burst of 7.62 rounds smashed into the rock shelf beneath them, spraying chips of ice into Nora's face. The insurgents couldn't see them. They were too far away, completely hidden in the pitch blackness of the mountain. But they had finally figured out the general trajectory of the sniper fire. They were using sheer volume to compensate for accuracy hosing the ridgeline. "Nora, we need to displace!" O'Connor shouted over the deafening supersonic crack of incoming fire. "Grab the rifle, we move back." "No!" Nora barked, spitting blood onto the snow. "If we move, we lose the angle. Schaefer dies. Gaines dies." She shoved her battered face back into the scope. The incoming fire was absolutely terrifying, but it was also a neon beacon. The two PKM gunners were lighting up the thermal display with every sustained burst. They were standing shoulder to shoulder behind a low rock wall, firing blindly upward into the dark sky. "Distance!" she screamed over the gunfire. 3,100 wind is back to 10 knots right to left. Nora didn't bother dialing the turrets. There was absolutely no time. She used the mil dots in the reticle, holding over for elevation and holding off for wind, doing the complex algebraic calculations purely by instinct, muscle memory, and desperation. She fired. She didn't wait for the splash. She violently racked the bolt, slammed it forward, shifted the crosshairs to the second glowing machine gunner, held her breath, fired again. The dual compounded impacts of the recoil tore a raw scream from her throat, but it was entirely drowned out by the massive muzzle blast. Her right arm went completely, terrifyingly numb. The heavy rifle slipped slightly off her shoulder, digging into the dirt. She lay there, panting, staring through the glass with her one good eye, her chest heaving against the ice. 12 seconds passed. The longest 12 seconds of her life. The incoming fire abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute, broken only by the ringing in her ears. On the distant ridge, two bright thermal masses lay perfectly still behind the low rock wall. The barrels of their heavy machine guns glowed dull orange in the infrared spectrum, slowly cooling in the sub-zero air. "Clear," O'Connor whispered. He dropped his head onto the snow, his whole body shaking. "Ridge is clear. Adrenaline has a half-life. When it finally decays, it doesn't leave you gracefully. It strips the scaffolding from your nervous system and lets the house collapse." Nora couldn't move her right arm. It hung dead at her side, a heavy, useless pendulum of meat and bone. The sharp pop in her collarbone had blossomed into a sickening, radiant heat that completely contrasted with the freezing air. O'Connor didn't celebrate. He just methodically collapsed the spotting scope, his breathing ragged. He looked over at her. Her face was a mess. A layer of skin had torn away when she finally peeled her cheek from the icy Kydex stock, leaving a raw, weeping patch of red on her pale face. Her lip was split. "We need to move," O'Connor said, his voice flat. He reached for her Chaytak. "Don't touch my rifle," she managed to say. The words were slurred. Her jaw muscles were shivering so violently she kept biting her own tongue. "Doll, your shoulder is wrecked. You can't carry it." "Don't touch it." She rolled onto her left side, dragging her knees up to her chest. It took her 3 tries to get her feet under her. The snow crust broke, plunging her waist deep again. She grabbed the massive rifle with her left hand, dragging it by the heavy sling. It weighed 31 pounds. Right now it felt like dragging an anvil. O'Connor didn't argue. He just grabbed the Pelican case and the remaining gear, shouldering his own pack. They began the descent. It was a clumsy, humiliating stumble in the dark. Gravity did most of the work, pulling them down the treacherous shale. Nora fell twice. The first time she caught herself on her bad arm and blacked out for a full 3 seconds from the pain. When she came to, O'Connor was holding her up by the collar of her plate carrier, his breathing heavy in her ear. He didn't ask if she was okay. He just hauled her upright and kept walking. By the time they reached the extraction point on the lower shelf, the heavy thwack-thwack-thwack of a UH-60 Black Hawk was already beating against the canyon walls. The helicopter hovered inches above the uneven ice, kicking up a miniature blizzard. The side door was open. Wyatt was kneeling on the floor grid, his hands completely slick with dark, freezing blood, pressing his entire body weight into Gaines's groin to keep the femoral artery pinched shut. Gaines was grey, not pale, the colour of wet cement. Nora crawled into the cabin. She didn't have the strength to step up. O'Connor threw the gear in behind her and hauled himself up, slapping the crew chief's leg to signal they were clear. The bird banked violently, diving away from the mountain. Inside the cabin the noise was deafening, but the silence among the team was heavier. No one looked at Nora. They were all staring at Gaines, watching his shallow, rapid breathing, watching the corpsman frantically spike a bag of whole blood and squeeze it into his IV line. Nora slumped against the aluminum bulkhead. The violent vibration of the helicopter rattled her shattered shoulder. She didn't care. She closed her eyes. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with the heavy metallic stench of Gaines's blood. It smelled like raw pennies. 40 minutes later they hit the tarmac at the forward operating base. Medical staff swarmed the bird before the rotors even began to spin down. They dragged Gaines out on a litter, Wyatt still sprinting alongside them, his hands still pressed into the wound. Nora waited. She let the assaulters clear out first. Then, moving entirely with her left side, she dragged herself off the deck. The medical tent was blindingly bright. It smelled intensely of bleach iodine and sweat. A young Navy corpsman took one look at Nora, grabbed her by the good arm, and steered her onto a canvas cot. "Plate carrier off," he ordered, pulling out a pair of trauma shears. "I can't lift my right arm," she rasped. He didn't hesitate. He cut the straps off her carrier, letting the heavy ceramic plates crash to the floor. He cut her combat shirt open next, slicing the thick fabric from the collar down to her waist. Her shoulder was a horrific landscape of trauma. The skin was mottled black, deep purple, and angry yellow. The collarbone was visibly displaced, pressing a hard, ugly lump against the bruised flesh. The corpsman hissed through his teeth. Dislocated AC joint, fractured clavicle, deep tissue contusions. He rattled off, shining a penlight into her eyes to check for a concussion. "You're going to need orthopedic surgery, Chief. How many rounds did you fire tonight?" she whispered. The corpsman stopped. He looked at the massive bruising, then looked at her tiny frame. He shook his head slowly, reaching for a syringe of morphine. An hour later, her arm was locked in a rigid brace. The morphine had reduced the sharp agony to a dull, heavy throb. She sat on the edge of the cot, wearing a borrowed, oversized grey fleece jacket. The flap of the medical tent pushed open. Schaefer walked in. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. His uniform was stained with Gaines's blood. He had deep, dark circles under his eyes, and the grit of the mountain was still ground into the lines of his face. He didn't say anything at first. He just pulled up a metal folding chair and sat down heavily across from her. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at the dirt floor. "Gaines is out of surgery," Schaefer finally said. His voice was gravelly, completely devoid of its usual booming authority. "Vascular surgeon patched the artery. He's going to lose a lot of muscle function in that leg, but he'll keep it. He's alive." Nora nodded slowly. "Good." Schaefer looked up. He looked at the massive brace holding her shoulder together. He looked at the raw, weeping burn on her cheek. Then slowly his eyes dropped to her boots. Because the medical cot was standard height, her boots were dangling 2 inches above the floor. Schaefer stared at them for a long time. The silence stretched heavy with the weight of the 9 dead men on a ridge 2 miles away. There was no apology. An apology would be cheap. It would be an insult to the sheer brutal mechanics of what she had just done to save his team. He leaned back in the chair and let out a long, slow exhale. "We're writing the after-action report now," Schaefer said quietly, looking back up into her eyes. The mockery was gone. The patronizing warmth was gone. What remained was a cold, absolute reverence. "O'Connor gave me the Rangers. Nobody at command is going to believe it." Nora shifted her weight, the morphine making her head swim slightly. She looked Schaefer dead in the eye. "Tell them to check the math," she said. "If this story got your pulse pounding, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more raw, unapologetic military storytelling. Which part of Nora's impossible shot chilled you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Share this video with anyone who knows that true grit isn't about your size. It's about the math, the focus, and pulling the trigger when it counts. Stay sharp, and we'll see you in the next mission.